Do you know the whole North End once had a set of tunnels that kept certain people in touch with each other's houses and the burying ground and the sea? Pickman's model. You needn't think I'm crazy, Eliot. Plenty of others have queerer prejudices than this. Why don't you laugh at Oliver's grandfather, who won't ride in a motor? If I don't like that damned subway, it's my own business, and we got here more quickly anyhow in the taxi. We'd have had to walk up the hill from Park Street if we'd taken the car. I know I'm more nervous than I was when you saw me last year, but you don't need to hold a clinic over it. There's plenty of reason, God knows. And I fancy I'm lucky to be sane at all. Why the third degree? You didn't use to be so inquisitive. Well, if you must hear it, I don't know why you shouldn't. Maybe you ought to, anyhow, for you kept writing me like a grieved parent when you heard I'd begun to cut the art club and keep away from Pickman. Now that he's disappeared, I go around to the club once in a while, but my nerves aren't what they were. No, I don't know what's become of Pickman, and I don't like to guess. You might have surmised I had some inside information when I dropped him, and that's why I don't want to think where he's gone. Let the police find what they can. It won't be much, judging from the fact that they don't know yet of the old North End place he hired under the name of Peters. I'm not sure that I could find it again myself. Not that I'd ever try, even in broad daylight. Yes, I do know, or I'm afraid I know, why he maintained it. I'm coming to that, and I think you'll understand before I'm through why I don't tell the police. They would ask me to guide them, but I couldn't go back there even if I knew the way. There was something there, and now I can't use the subway, or, and you may as well have your laugh at this too, go down into cellars anymore. I should think you'd have known I didn't drop Pickman for the same silly reasons that fussy old women like Dr. Reed, or Joe Minott, or Bosworth did. Morbid art doesn't shock me, and when a man has the genius Pickman had, I feel it an honor to know him, no matter what direction his work takes. Boston never had a greater painter than Richard Upton Pickman. I said it at first, and I say it still, and I never swerved an inch either when he showed that ghoul feeding. That, you remember, was when Mino cut him. It takes profound art and profound insight into nature to turn out stuff like Pickman's. Any magazine cover hack can splash paint around wildly and call it a nightmare, or a witch's sabbath, or a portrait of the devil. But only a great painter can make such a thing really scare or ring true. That's because only a real artist knows the actual anatomy of the terrible, or the physiology of fear. The exact sort of lines and proportions that connect up with latent instincts or hereditary memories of fright, and the proper color contrasts and lighting effects to stir the dormant sense of strangeness. I don't have to tell you why a Fuseli really brings a shiver, while a cheap ghost story frontispiece merely makes us laugh. There's something those fellows catch beyond life that they're able to make us catch for a second. Doré had it, Syme has it, Angarola of Chicago has it, and Pickman had it as no man ever had it before or, I hope to heaven, ever will again. Don't ask me what it is they see. You know, in ordinary art, there's all the difference in the world between the vital breathing things drawn from nature or models, and the artificial truck that commercial small fry reel off in a bare studio by rule. Well, I should say that the really weird artist has a kind of vision which makes models, or summons up what amounts to actual scenes from the spectral world he lives in. Anyhow, he manages to turn out results that differ from the pretender's mince-pie dreams in just about the same way that the life painter's results differ from the concoctions of a correspondence school cartoonist. If I had ever seen what Pickman saw, but no. Here, let's have a drink before we get any deeper. Gad, I wouldn't be alive if I'd ever seen what that man, if he was a man, saw. You recall that Pickman's forte was faces. I don't believe anybody since Goya could put so much of sheer hell into a set of features or a twist of expression. And before Goya, you have to go back to the medieval chaps who did the gargoyles and chimeras on Notre Dame and Mont Saint-Michel. They believed all sorts of things. And maybe they saw all sorts of things too, for the Middle Ages had some curious phases. I remember your asking Pickman yourself once, the year before you went away, wherever in thunder he got such ideas and visions. Wasn't that a nasty laugh he gave you? It was partly because of that laugh that Reed dropped him. Reed, you know, had just taken up comparative pathology and was full of pompous inside stuff about the biological or evolutionary significance of this or that mental or physical symptom. He said Pickman repelled him more and more every day and almost frightened him toward the last. That the fellow's features and expression were slowly developing in a way he didn't like, in a way that wasn't human. He had a lot of talk about diet and said Pickman must be abnormal and eccentric to the last degree. I suppose you told Reed, if you and he had any correspondence over it, that he'd let Pickman's paintings get on his nerves or harrow up his imagination. I know I told him that myself then, but keep in mind that I didn't drop Pickman for anything like this. On the contrary, my admiration for him kept growing, for that ghoul feeding was a tremendous achievement. As you know, the club wouldn't exhibit it, and the Museum of Fine Arts wouldn't accept it as a gift, and I can add that nobody would buy it. So Pickman had it right in his house till he went. Now, his father has it in Salem. You know, Pickman comes of old Salem stock, and had a witch ancestor hanged in 1692. I got into the habit of calling on Pickman quite often, especially after I began making notes for a monograph on weird art. Probably it was his work which put the idea into my head, and anyhow, I found him a mine of data and suggestions when I came to develop it. He showed me all the paintings and drawings he had about, including some pen and ink sketches that would, I verily believe, have got him kicked out of the club if many of the members had seen them. Before long I was pretty nearly a devotee, and would listen for hours like a schoolboy to art theories and philosophic speculations wild enough to qualify him for the Danvers Asylum. My hero worship, coupled with the fact that people generally were commencing to have less and less to do with him, made him get very confidential with me, and one evening he hinted that if I were fairly close-mouthed and none too squeamish, he might show me something rather unusual, something a bit stronger than anything he had in the house. You know, he said, there are things that won't do for Newbury Street. Things that are out of place here, and that can't be conceived here anyhow. It's my business to catch the overtones of the soul, and you won't find those in a parvenu set of artificial streets on made land. Back Bay isn't Boston. It isn't anything yet, because it's had no time to pick up memories and attract local spirits. If there are any ghosts here, they're the tame ghosts of a salt marsh and a shallow cove, and I want human ghosts. The ghosts of beings highly organized enough to have looked on hell and known the meaning of what they saw. The place for an artist to live is the North End. If any aesthete were sincere, he'd put up with the slums for the sake of the mass traditions. God, man, don't you realize that places like that weren't merely made, but actually grew? Generation after generation lived and felt and died there, and in days when people weren't afraid to live and feel and die. Don't you know there was a mill on Copp's Hill in 1632, and that half the present streets were laid out by 1650? I can show you houses that have stood 2 centuries and a half and more, houses that have witnessed what would make a modern house crumble into powder. What do moderns know of life and the forces behind it? You call the Salem witchcraft a delusion, but I'll wage my 4 times great-grandmother could have told you things. They hanged her on Gallows Hill, with Cotton Mather looking sanctimoniously on. Mather, damn him, was afraid somebody might succeed in kicking free of this accursed cage of monotony. I wish someone had laid a spell on him, or sucked his blood in the night. I can show you a house he lived in, and I can show you another one he was afraid to enter, in spite of all his fine, bold talk. He knew things he didn't dare put into that stupid Magnalia, or that puerile wonders of the invisible world. Look here. Do you know the whole North End once had a set of tunnels that kept certain people in touch with each other's houses, and the burying ground, and the sea? Let them prosecute and persecute above ground. Things went on every day that they couldn't reach, and voices laughed at night that they couldn't place. Out of 10 surviving houses built before 1700, and not moved, since I'll wager that in 8 I can show you something queer in the cellar. There's hardly a month that you don't read of workmen finding bricked-up arches and wells leading nowhere in this or that old place as it comes down. You could see one near Henchman Street from the elevated last year. There were witches and what their spells summoned, pirates and what they brought in from the sea, smugglers, privateers, and I tell you, people knew how to live and how to enlarge the bounds of life. In the old times, this wasn't the only world a bold and wise man could know. And to think of today in contrast, with such pale pink brains that even a club of supposed artists get shudders and convulsions if a picture goes beyond the feelings of a Beacon Street tea table. The only saving grace of the present is that it's too damned stupid to question the past very closely. What do maps and records and guidebooks really tell of the North End? At a guess, I'll guarantee to lead you to 30 or 40 alleys and networks of alleys north of Prince Street that aren't suspected by 10 living beings outside of the foreigners that swarm them. And what do those Dagos know of their meaning? No, Thurber, these ancient places are dreaming gorgeously and overflowing with wonder and terror and escapes from the commonplace, and yet there's not a living soul to understand or profit by them. Or rather, there's only one living soul, for I haven't been digging around in the past for nothing. See here, you're interested in this sort of thing. What if I told you that I've got another studio up there, where I can catch the night spirit of antique horror and paint things that I couldn't even think of in Newbury Street? Naturally, I don't tell those cursed old maids at the club. With Reed, damn him, whispering even as it is that I'm a sort of monster bound down the toboggan of reverse evolution, Thurber, I decided long ago that one must paint terror as well as beauty from life. So I did some exploring in places where I had reason to know terror lives. I've got a place that I don't believe 3 living Nordic men besides myself have ever seen. It isn't so very far from the elevated as distance goes, but it's centuries away as the soul goes. I took it because of the queer old brick well in the cellar, one of the sort I told you about. The shack's almost tumbling down, so that nobody else would live there, and I'd hate to tell you how little I pay for it. The windows are boarded up, but I like that all the better, since I don't want daylight for what I do. I paint in the cellar, where the inspiration is thickest, but I've other rooms furnished on the ground floor. A Sicilian owns it, and I've hired it under the name of Peters. If you're game, I'll take you there tonight. I think you'd enjoy the pictures, for as I said, I've let myself go a bit there. It's no vast tour. I sometimes do it on foot, for I don't want to attract attention with a taxi in such a place. We can take the shuttle at the South Station for Battery Street, and after that, the walk isn't much. Well, Eliot, there wasn't much for me to do after that harangue, but to keep myself from running instead of walking for the first vacant cab we could sight. We changed to the elevated at the South Station, and at about 12 o'clock had climbed down the steps at Battery Street and struck along the old waterfront past Constitution Wharf. I didn't keep track of the cross streets, and can't tell you yet which it was we turned up, but I know it wasn't Greenough Lane. When we did turn, it was to climb through the deserted length of the oldest and dirtiest alley I ever saw in my life, with crumbling-looking gables, broken small-paned windows, and archaic chimneys that stood out half-disintegrated against the moonlit sky. I don't believe there were 3 houses in sight that hadn't been standing in Cotton Mather's time. Certainly I glimpsed at least 2 with an overhang, and once I thought I saw a peaked roofline of the almost forgotten pre-gambrel type, though antiquarians tell us there are none left in Boston. From that alley, which had a dim light, we turned to the left into an equally silent and still narrower alley with no light at all, and in a minute made what I think was an obtuse angled bend toward the right in the dark. Not long after this, Pickman produced a flashlight and revealed an antediluvian 10-paneled door that looked damnably worm-eaten. Unlocking it, he ushered me into a barren hallway with what was once splendid dark oak paneling, simple of course, but thrillingly suggestive of the times of Andros and Phipps and the witchcraft. Then he took me through a door on the left, lighted an oil lamp, and told me to make myself at home. Now, I'm what the man in the street would call fairly hard-boiled, but I'll confess that what I saw on the walls of that room gave me a bad turn. They were his pictures, you know, the ones he couldn't paint or even show in Newbury Street, and he was right when he said he had let himself go. Here, have another drink. I need one anyhow. There's no use in my trying to tell you what they were like, because the awful, the blasphemous horror, and the unbelievable loathsomeness and moral footor came from simple touches quite beyond the power of words to classify. There was none of the exotic technique you see in Sidney Syme, none of the trans-Saturnian landscapes and lunar fungi that Clark Ashton Smith uses to freeze the blood. The backgrounds were mostly old churchyards, deep woods, cliffs by the sea, brick tunnels, ancient panelled rooms, or simple vaults of masonry, hill burying ground, which could not be many blocks away from this very house, was a favourite scene. The madness and monstrosity lay in the figures in the foreground, for Pickman's morbid art was preeminently one of demonic portraiture. These figures were seldom completely human, but often approached humanity in varying degree. Most of the bodies, while roughly bipedal, had a forward slumping and a vaguely canine cast. The texture of the majority was a kind of unpleasant rubberiness. Ugh, I can see them now. Their occupations, well, don't ask me to be too precise. They were usually feeding, I won't say on what. They were sometimes shown in groups in cemeteries or underground passages, and often appeared to be in battle over their prey, or rather, their treasure trove. And what damnable expressiveness Pickman sometimes gave the sightless faces of this charnel booty. Occasionally, the things were shown leaping through open windows at night, or squatting on the chests of sleepers, worrying at their throats. One canvas shewed a ring of them baying about a hanged witch on Gallows Hill, whose dead face held a close kinship to theirs. But don't get the idea that it was all this hideous business of theme and setting which struck me faint. I'm not a 3-year-old kid, and I'd seen much like this before. It was the faces, Eliot, those accursed faces, that leered and slavered out of the canvas with the very breath of life. By God, man, I verily believe they were alive. That nauseous wizard had waked the fires of hell in pigment, and his brush had been a nightmare-spawning wand. Give me that decanter, Eliot. There was one thing called the lesson, heaven pity me, that I ever saw it. Listen, can you fancy a squatting circle of nameless dog-like things in a churchyard teaching a small child how to feed like themselves? The price of a changeling, I suppose. You know the old myth about how the weird people leave their spawn in cradles in exchange for the human babes they steal. Pickman was showing what happens to those stolen babes, how they grow up, and then I began to see a hideous relationship in the faces of the human and non-human figures. He was, in all his gradations of morbidity, between the frankly non-human and the degradedly human, establishing a sardonic linkage and evolution. The dog things were developed from mortals, and no sooner had I wondered what he made of their own young as left with mankind in the form of changelings, than my eye caught a picture embodying that very thought. It was that of an ancient Puritan interior, a heavily beamed room with lattice windows, a settle and clumsy 17th century furniture, with the family sitting about while the father read from the scriptures. Every face but one showed nobility and reverence, but that one reflected the mockery of the pit. It was that of a young man in years, and no doubt belonged to a supposed son of that pious father. But in essence, it was the kin of the unclean things. It was their changeling, and in a spirit of supreme irony, Pickman had given the features a very perceptible resemblance to his own. By this time, Pickman had lighted a lamp in an adjoining room, and was politely holding open the door for me, asking me if I would care to see his modern studies. I hadn't been able to give him much of my opinions. I was too speechless with fright and loathing, but I think he fully understood and felt highly complimented. And now I want to assure you again, Eliot, that I'm no mollycoddle to scream at anything which shows a bit of departure from the usual. I'm middle-aged and decently sophisticated, and I guess you saw enough of me in France to know I'm not easily knocked out. Remember, too, that I'd just about recovered my wind and gotten used to those frightful pictures which turned colonial New England into a kind of annex of hell. Well, in spite of all this, that next room forced a real scream out of me, and I had to clutch at the doorway to keep from keeling over. The other chamber had shown a pack of ghouls and witches overrunning the world of our forefathers, but this one brought the horror right into our own daily life. God, how that man could paint! There was a study called Subway Accident, in which a flock of the vile things were clambering up from some unknown catacomb through a crack in the floor of the Boylston Street subway and attacking a crowd of people on the platform. Another showed a dance on Copp's Hill among the tombs with the background of today. Then there were any number of cellar views, with monsters creeping in through holes and rifts in the masonry and grinning as they squatted behind barrels or furnaces, and waited for their first victim to descend the stairs. One disgusting canvas seemed to depict a vast cross-section of Beacon Hill, with ant-like armies of the mephitic monsters squeezing themselves through burrows that honeycombed the ground. Dances in the modern cemeteries were freely pictured, and another conception somehow shocked me more than all the rest. A scene in an unknown vault, where scores of the beasts crowded about one who held a well-known Boston guidebook and was evidently reading aloud. All were pointing to a certain passage, and every face seemed so distorted with epileptic and reverberant laughter that I almost thought I heard the fiendish echoes. The title of the picture was Holmes, Lowell, and Longfellow Lie, Buried in Mount Auburn. As I gradually steadied myself and got readjusted to this second room of deviltry and morbidity, I began to analyze some of the points in my sickening loathing. In the first place, I said to myself, these things repelled because of the utter inhumanity and callous cruelty they showed in Pickman. The fellow must be a relentless enemy of all mankind to take such glee in the torture of brain and flesh, and the degradation of the mortal tenement. In the second place, they terrified because of their very greatness. Their art was the art that convinced. When we saw the pictures, we saw the demons themselves, and were afraid of them. And the queer part was that Pickman got none of his power from the use of selectiveness or bizarrerie. Nothing was blurred, distorted, or conventionalized. Outlines were sharp and lifelike, and details were almost painfully defined. And the faces. It was not any mere artist's interpretation that we saw. It was pandemonium itself, crystal clear in stark objectivity. That was it. By heaven, the man was not a fantasist or romanticist at all. He did not even try to give us the churning prismatic ephemera of dreams, but coldly and sardonically reflected some stable, mechanistic, and well-established horror world, which he saw fully, brilliantly, squarely, and unfalteringly. God knows what that world can have been, or where he ever glimpsed the blasphemous shapes that loped and trotted and crawled through it. But whatever the baffling source of his images, one thing was plain. Pickman was in every sense, in conception and in execution, a thorough, painstaking, and almost scientific realist. My host was now leading the way down cellar to his actual studio, and I braced myself for some hellish effects among the unfinished canvases. As we reached the bottom of the damp stairs, he turned his flashlight to a corner of the large open space at hand, revealing the circular brick curb of what was evidently a great well in the earthen floor. We walked nearer, and I saw that it must be 5 feet across, with walls a good foot thick and some 6 inches above the ground level. Solid work of the 17th century, or I was much mistaken. That, Pickman said, was the kind of thing he had been talking about, an aperture of the network of tunnels that used to undermine the hill. I noticed idly that it didn't seem to be bricked up, and that a heavy disc of wood formed the apparent cover. Thinking of the things this well must have been connected with, if Pickman's wild hints had not been mere rhetoric, I shivered slightly, then turned to follow him up a step and through a narrow door into a room of fair size, provided with a wooden floor and furnished as a studio. An acetylene gas outfit gave the light necessary for work. The unfinished pictures on easels or propped against the walls were as ghastly as the finished ones upstairs, and showed the painstaking methods of the artist. Scenes were blocked out with extreme care, and penciled guidelines told of the minute exactitude which Pickman used in getting the right perspective and proportions. The man was great. I say it even now, knowing as much as I do. A large camera on a table excited my notice. and Pickman told me that he used it in taking scenes for backgrounds, so that he might paint them from photographs in the studio, instead of carting his outfit around the town for this or that view. He thought a photograph quite as good as an actual scene or model for sustained work, and declared he employed them regularly. There was something very disturbing about the nauseous sketches and half-finished monstrosities that leered around from every side of the room, and when Pickman suddenly unveiled a huge canvas on the side away from the light, I could not for my life keep back a loud scream. The second I had emitted that night, it echoed and echoed through the dim vaultings of that ancient and nitrous cellar, and I had to choke back a flood of reaction that threatened to burst out as hysterical laughter. Merciful Creator, but I don't know how much was real and how much was feverish fancy. It doesn't seem to me that Earth can hold a dream like that. It was a colossal and nameless blasphemy with glaring red eyes, and it held in bony claws a thing that had been a man, gnawing at the head as a child nibbles at a stick of candy. Its position was a kind of crouch, and as one looked, one felt that at any moment it might drop its present prey and seek a juicier morsel. But damn it all, it wasn't even the fiendish subject that made it such an immortal fountainhead of all panic. Not that, nor the dog face with its pointed ears, bloodshot eyes, flat nose, and drooling lips. It wasn't the scaly claws, nor the mold-caked body, nor the half-hooved feet. None of these, though any one of them might well have driven an excitable man to madness. It was the technique, Eliot, the cursed, the impious, the unnatural technique. As I am a living being, I never elsewhere saw the actual breath of life so fused into a canvas. The monster was there. It glared and gnawed and gnawed, and glared, and I knew that only a suspension of nature's laws could ever let a man paint a thing like that without a model, without some glimpse of the nether world which no mortal unsold to the fiend has ever had. Pinned with a thumbtack to a vacant part of the canvas was a piece of paper now badly curled up. Probably, I thought, a photograph from which Pickman meant to paint a background as hideous as the nightmare it was to enhance. I reached out to uncurl and look at it, when suddenly I saw Pickman start as if shot. He had been listening with peculiar intensity ever since my shocked scream had waked unaccustomed echoes in the dark cellar, and now he seemed struck with a fright which, though not comparable to my own, had in it more of the physical than of the spiritual. He drew a revolver and motioned me to silence, then stepped out into the main cellar and closed the door behind him. I think I was paralyzed for an instant. Imitating Pickman's listening, I fancied I heard a faint scurrying sound somewhere, and a series of squeals or bleats in a direction I couldn't determine. I thought of huge rats and shuddered. Then there came a subdued sort of clatter, which somehow set me all in gooseflesh. A furtive, groping kind of clatter. Though I can't attempt to convey what I mean in words. It was like heavy wood falling on stone or brick. Wood on brick. What did that make me think of? It came again, and louder. There was a vibration as if the wood had fallen farther than it had fallen before. After that followed a sharp grating noise, a shouted gibberish from Pickman, and the deafening discharge of all 6 chambers of a revolver, fired spectacularly, as a lion tamer might fire in the air for effect. A muffled squeal or squawk, and a thud. Then more wood and brick grating, a pause, and the opening of the door, at which I'll confess I started violently. Pickman reappeared with his smoking weapon, cursing the bloated rats that infested the ancient well. "The deuce knows what they eat, Thurber," he grinned. For those archaic tunnels touched graveyard and witch den and seacoast, but whatever it is, they must have run short, for they were devilish anxious to get out. Your yelling stirred them up, I fancy. Better be cautious in these old places. Our rodent friends are the one drawback, though I sometimes think they're a positive asset by way of atmosphere and color. Well, Eliot, that was the end of the night's adventure. Pickman had promised to show me the place, and heaven knows he had done it. He led me out of that tangle of alleys in another direction, it seems. For when we sighted a lamp-post, we were in a half-familiar street, with monotonous rows of mingled tenement blocks and old houses. Charter Street it turned out to be, but I was too flustered to notice just where we hit it. We were too late for the elevated and walked back downtown through Hanover Street. I remember that walk. We switched from Tremont up Beacon, and Pickman left me at the corner of Joy, where I turned off. I never spoke to him again. Why did I drop him? Don't be impatient. Wait till I ring for coffee. We've had enough of the other stuff. But I, for one, need something. No, it wasn't the paintings I saw in that place. Though I'll swear they were enough to get him ostracized in 9/10 of the homes and clubs of Boston, and I guess you won't wonder now why I have to steer clear of subways and cellars. It was something I found in my coat the next morning. You know, the curled-up paper tacked to that frightful canvas in the cellar. The thing I thought was a photograph of some scene he meant to use as a background for that monster. That last scare had come while I was reaching to uncurl it, and it seems I had vacantly crumpled it into my pocket. But here's the coffee. Take it black, Eliot, if you're wise. Yes, that paper was the reason I dropped Pickman. Richard Upton Pickman, the greatest artist I have ever known, and the foulest being that ever leaped the bounds of life into the pits of myth and madness. Eliot, old Reed was right. He wasn't strictly human. Either he was born in strange shadow, or he'd found a way to unlock the forbidden gate. It's all the same now. For he's gone, back into the fabulous darkness he loved to haunt. Here, let's have the chandelier going. Don't ask me to explain or even conjecture about what I burned. Don't ask me, either, what lay behind that mole-like scrambling Pickman was so keen to pass off as rats. There are secrets, you know, which might have come down from old Salem times, and Cotton Mather tells even stranger things. You know how damned lifelike Pickman's paintings were, how we all wondered where he got those faces. Well, that paper wasn't a photograph of any background after all. What it showed was simply the monstrous being he was painting on that awful canvas. It was the model he was using, and its background was merely the wall of the cellar studio in minute detail. But by God, Eliot, it was a photograph from life. First Eliot, then Mickey, climbed over the well's lip and lowered themselves into the silent darkness. The air grew colder and damper as they descended. Their flashlights flickered against rough stone walls. After a tense, careful climb, they landed on solid ground in what appeared to be a narrow corridor. The Search. Days after Thurber's disquieting tale reached Eliot's ears, he found himself pacing the damp streets of Boston's North End. The hour was late, and the street lamps cast long, wavering shadows across the cobblestones. His mind drifted back time and again to Thurber's tale, the wild claims, the ghastly paintings, and the mysterious well. Despite Thurber's shaking voice and bloodless face, Eliot remained somewhat unconvinced. He had known Thurber since their days together in the American Expeditionary Forces in France. They had served side by side, endured the mud shells and the terrible boredom that lurks between battles. He trusted Thurber, but felt certain something had colored his friend's account. Maybe fear or shock. Eliot needed evidence. He needed to see the place with his own eyes. It was very unlikely they would somehow find Pickman alive, but even so he imagined him lying broken at the bottom of the well, dead or weakened from weeks of starvation. His first thought had been to recruit Thurber himself, but Thurber wanted nothing more to do with the matter. He had refused Eliot's invitation with the trembling finality of a man who had stared into depths of madness. So, Eliot turned instead to another comrade from the old days in France, a former sergeant named Mickey Rowan. Mickey had been a boxer before the war, a prize fighter who knew how to handle himself in any situation. He was strong, steady, and didn't rattle easily. Just the kind of man Eliot needed if he was going to poke into Pickman's old lair. The old sergeant was not hard to convince. Over a quiet meeting in a backroom tavern, Eliot laid out what he knew. He told Mickey of Thurber's frantic recollection, of Pickman's talent for conjuring horrors upon the canvas, of his sudden and inexplicable vanishing. Mickey listened soberly, stirring the cheap whiskey in his glass with one thick finger. He knew Eliot was no flighty gossip. If Eliot wanted to see for himself, Mickey would come along. After all, he had faced machine guns and mustard gas. A dusty old studio held no terror he couldn't bear. The two men agreed to begin their search the following evening. Eliot, working from Thurber's tale, and through discreet questioning around the North End, had a general idea where Pickman's studio was located. That very evening, as Eliot and Mickey made a final pass through those winding alleys, a stranger hailed them from across the street. He was tall and lean, with a cap pulled low over his eyes and a cautious smile. He called Mickey by name and said something about having known him in the old battalion. Mickey looked at him and asked the man his name. "Jack Crawley," the stranger said, tipping his cap. "We crossed paths near Marne, I believe. You might not recall me, Sergeant, but I never forget a face." Mickey narrowed his eyes, trying to fish through hazy wartime memories. There had been many men, and not all had stuck around long enough to leave a deep impression. Still, Jack carried himself like a soldier, straight-backed, calm. He seemed local too, for he spoke easily of the North End and claimed to know exactly where they could find the studio. Eliot and Mickey were cautious, but this Jack fellow seemed harmless. "I've heard the rumors about Pickman," Jack said. "He was seen coming and going, even though I suppose he thought he was unknown to any and all in the North End. If you want, I'll show you the spot and help you, for old time's sake. Let's say we meet tomorrow night, after dark." Eliot and Mickey exchanged glances. This was an unexpected turn of events, but perhaps not unwelcome. The North End's tangled lanes were confusing, and time was slipping by. Besides, Eliot had a revolver in his coat and Mickey carried a heavy crowbar and more than one weapon. They were no easy marks. They agreed to meet Jack the following evening, just before the moon rose high. When the time came, Eliot and Mickey were prepared. Armed and steady, they followed Jack through a series of twisting alleys, past old brick buildings whose slumped shoulders spoke of centuries of quiet decay. Jack led them confidently, making easy conversation, as though they were old friends out for a stroll. The streets grew quieter and gloomier, until finally, at the end of a crooked lane, stood an ancient building of wood and stone, and with a worm-eaten 10-paneled door. Parts of its roof seemed to have caved in, and the windows were boarded over. This, Jack assured them, was Pickman's studio. Mickey gripped his crowbar and tested the door. It held, So he set to work. With a series of heaving motions and dull thuds, the boards and old lock gave way, and the door creaked open into a dark, musty interior. They waited for a few moments, but nothing indicated that someone had taken notice of their actions. Mickey's flashlight pierced the gloom, revealing a large room scattered with dusty canvases, broken easels, and paint-smeared rags. The air smelled faintly of mold and old turpentine. They looked around carefully, finding only a few pieces of Pickman's art, but at least they were now confident that this was the right place. Most of the paintings were unfinished sketches, ghoulish outlines and distorted faces, but nothing more extreme than the publicly known pieces. There were no monstrous secrets waiting just inside the door, no rotted remains, no unholy altars. Eliot felt an odd mixture of relief and disappointment. It seemed that, on the surface at least, Thurber's tale had outstripped the truth. They pressed deeper into the house and eventually descended to the cellar. Here they found both Pickman's studio and the sinister old well. Mickey shone his flashlight down. The well was deep, but seemed dry. No Pickman, no glint of water, just stony darkness. The beam caught what looked like a floor many yards below, as though the well connected to some underground chamber. The two men looked at each other. Perhaps this was where Thurber's unimaginable horrors had lurked. Perhaps the true secrets lay below. The studio held little of interest and didn't live up to Thurber's vivid description. After conferring in low voices, Eliot and Mickey decided to go down the well. They had brought a heavy rope for just such a possibility. They braced it against a sturdy column and tested its strength. Jack seemed uneasy as they prepared to descend. "I'll keep watch up here," he offered. "I'm not much good with heights, and someone should stand guard." Eliot and Mickey agreed, each taking a strong grip on the rope. First Eliot, then Mickey, climbed over the well's lip and lowered themselves into the silent darkness. The air grew colder and damper as they descended. Their flashlights flickered against rough stone walls. After a tense, careful climb, they landed on solid ground in what appeared to be a narrow corridor, dungeon-like, lined with irregular old stones. They scarcely had time to look around before a startling sound reached their ears. A sharp rustle and the scrape of something above. The rope, their lifeline to the surface, tumbled suddenly down at their feet. Eliot's heart lurched. He swung his flashlight upward, shouting Jack's name. Far above, in the dim halo of their lights, they caught a glimpse of the well's circular rim. And there stood Jack, not alone, but surrounded by several shadowy shapes, barely distinguishable in the gloom. Mickey cursed under his breath. Eliot felt a trickle of cold sweat at the back of his neck. 1,000 questions crowded into his mind. Who were these figures? Had Jack betrayed them somehow? In that suspended moment, the truth eluded them. They stood in the bowels of an unknown subterranean passage, weapons still at hand but rope gone. Above, Jack and his companions watched silently. Eliot and Mickey realized with sinking dread that they were trapped, two men alone in a buried corridor. "What is this, Jack?" Mickey growled. "This is how you treat old war buddies. Who are your friends?" While he spoke, he raised his shotgun, pointing it towards Jack. "Don't think I can't get a few of you even from down here. Anyone tries to back away, I'll fire and worry later." Eliot had a stricken look, but likewise raised his revolver, aiming it at one of the shadowy figures. "Oh, you don't disappoint," Jack said, his voice filled with mirth. "Yes, maybe you can hit me, and then my friends will shoot back and that will be that. Why don't you listen to what I have to say instead, and maybe you can get out of this alive?" "All right, you bastard," Mickey said. "What crazy reason do you have for this? Bloody idiot. I'll keep it short and sweet if you watch your tongue. I was never in your little war. There are more important things in this world, you see. Things an uninitiated insect such as yourself could never understand." At this point, one of the shadowy figures raised his hand to silence Jack and took a step forward. He spoke with a dark, rasping voice. "There are many exits from the tunnel system that you are now in. All you have to do is find one of them and get out, and we will leave you alone." "And I guess that will be just a jolly walk in the park," Mickey muttered. "All right. Come on, Eliot, let's go." The two men at the well bottom backed away, so they were no longer possible targets for the figures above. "Well," the rasping voice continued, "you might want to stay away from some of our friends that call those tunnels home." At this, an ugly and hoarse laughter erupted from the other figures. Eliot and Mickey stood in subdued silence in the dark tunnel, while the strangers placed the heavy wooden disc in place over the well. All the while, they were singing an eerie hymn. "By the charnel winds of nighted gulfs, and the silent watchful eyes beyond mortal ken, we beseech thee, O dweller at the threshold. Hear our whispers in the hollow gloom, O keeper of forbidden gates, and stir from thy slumber beneath black seas of infinity. In our blood and fear, we open the crooked door. In our minds, we make a throne of dread. Attend our plea, Ancient One, and fill these trembling vessels with thy nameless might." The Amateur. I found the frame in a dim, cluttered corner of an estate auction, one of those musty affairs held in an old parlor, the kind of place reeking of mildew and stale tobacco. The auctioneer hadn't given it more than a passing glance, but I'd spotted it right away. The frame's wood was warped and its gilding chipped, but something about the half-faded, almost erased sketch on the fine canvas caught my eye. It was nothing more than a smear of old charcoal lines and the suggestion of an artist's signature. When I looked carefully at the faded signature, my heart fluttered, and I knew I had to have it. R.U. Pickman, the well-known master of the macabre. After winning it for a pittance, I carried it home through the drizzle. My small Boston apartment with its miniature studio room smelled of turpentine and cheap acrylic. I was a painter. Well, I wanted to be. Nothing I'd created yet had garnered much attention. My work was conventional, mostly the sort of forgettable landscapes you see in cafe lobbies. But this frame, this half-lost piece, felt like an opportunity. At first, I had thought to paint something entirely new on the canvas, but if it was by Pickman, that changed things. Art that truly disturbed, not just pleased, had always intrigued me. Picasso, Goya's black paintings. My tastes always wandered close to the unsettling. I set the frame on my easel and examined it under the lamp. If this truly was a Pickman piece, it must have some real value. Of course, it looked incomplete, just a blur of charcoal strokes forming the suggestion of a crouched figure. To the naked eye, it was just a scribble, but I knew better. There was something in those lines, something waiting to be coaxed out. Later that night, as I adjusted my lamp and prepared my palettes, something in me insisted I try to restore it exactly as it once was. I had no records, no references, nothing to guide me, just my gut feeling that I should bring out the lines as they had been. My brush hovered over the faint charcoal marks, hesitating, uncertain. Then I began to redraw, lightly, using my own charcoal to deepen the shadows. I remember a curious excitement coursing through me. My hand moved as if guided by something else, an instinct I never knew I possessed. An hour later, I stepped back. The figure had become clearer, a hunched silhouette, limbs a touch too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and the suggestion of teeth, jagged, crooked, showed in the grainy darkness. It made my heart pound, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. Even half finished, I recognized a chilling vitality. The shape looked ready to spring right out of the paper. I barely slept that night. When I did drift off, I dreamt of dry scraping sounds and something heavy breathing just behind me. I awoke sweaty, thinking I heard a noise from the studio. Of course, there was nothing but silence. Still, I didn't dare to go near the studio until morning. The next night, however, I was drawn back. I turned on the lamp, picked up my charcoal, and began refining details. I found myself adding subtle textures to the creature's skin, suggesting folds and bumps, as though it had a leathery hide. Where had I learned to do that? I'd never drawn anything like it before, yet the lines came naturally, my hands sure, my mind oddly blank but focused. After a few hours, the creature's face had emerged, bulging eyes, deeply shadowed sockets, a mouth that stretched too wide. I'd never seen such malice in a grin before. Pickman's work indeed, but now something of my own as well. On the final night, after enduring the tediousness of my work as a clerk, I delved deeper. Somehow the frame seemed sturdier, as if it were no longer old and fragile, but reinforced by something seeping through the charcoal. I tried, laughing at myself, telling myself it was just nerves. I painted throughout the night. Finally, the thing on the canvas was nearly complete, its torso gaunt and angular, its limbs elongated, claws curled delicately over some invisible threshold. The eyes seemed alive, reflecting the lamplight as though the paper had depth. The suggestion of perspective was so vivid that I almost believed I could slip a finger inside the frame and touch it. As I put the final touches on the shadows around its maw, I felt it smile wider. No, I don't mean I painted it smiling wider. I mean it smiled. The canvas hadn't moved, but somehow the expression felt more cunning. My hand shook. I dropped my charcoal and stepped back, nearly knocking over my stool. For a moment, I just stared. Then came a soft scraping sound behind me. I spun around with a hammering heart, certain I'd see something lurking by the door. But there was nothing. When I looked back at the frame, the creature's eyes seemed locked onto mine. I could have sworn they followed my every movement. My throat went dry. This was madness. I needed sleep. I crashed in my bed, trying to forget that horrible grin. But I couldn't stay away. Before dawn, something compelled me to check on my work. I padded back into the studio and froze. The easel was empty. My heart seized. Had I put it down somewhere else? The frame was missing entirely. A rustling from the corner gave me a shock. The figure stood there, not on canvas, but in sickening three-dimensional reality. Its limbs bent wrong as it moved, and its grin revealed rows of needle-like teeth. I screamed, stumbling back, grasping for something, anything, and lost sight of it for a moment. When my eyes found the creature again, it was inches from my face, eyes shining with predatory glee. No one can say what happened to me. They only know I never showed up again, just a vanished wannabe artist who bit off more than he could chew. But if anyone dares to look closely at that dusty frame, they might notice a faint charcoal smear suggesting a bent figure not quite human, waiting, watching, willing someone else to bring it to life again. We backed away slowly. I didn't speak. Neither did Eliot. There was no joking about that place. Even a tough mug like me knows when to keep his trap shut. To imagine I've been walking on the streets above for decades, without guessing what was here. Down the well. Jack had betrayed us for some bizarre reason, throwing down our rope into the well and locking me and Eliot here in the tunnels, all the while singing along with his pals. Perfectly sane behavior. Were they all part of some kind of nutty cult, I wondered. Well, I'll worry about that later. Focus on the present, as my daddy used to say. There will always be time for payback. We'd only been down here a few hours by my best guess, but it felt like a damned week. The darkness clung to us, thick and wet, as Eliot and I shuffled through twisting old tunnels of stone. I had no idea why someone would build this kind of maze down here. Smugglers or pirates from old times, most likely. Some of the tunnels stank like something had died in them, which it probably had, and some tunnels had a palpable sense of evil about them that was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. My electric flashlight's beam flickered across decaying mortar, half-carved pillars, and scuttling shapes just out of sight. Eliot had gone quiet, a bad sign. Before, he'd been the nervous chatterbox. Now, he just hissed in pain whenever he tried to put weight on his leg. That run-in with those dog-like ghouls had been something from out of nightmares. They were stealthy, but their nauseous smell gave them away. They came at us from a connecting tunnel. Eliot emptied out his magazine while screaming and hit one or two. I got one good with my trusty shotgun. Then some kind of overgrown bastard with eyes like dead lanterns, some kind of alpha, pushed his way in front of the others. Eliot tried to reload while I hit it at close range, to little avail. It swiped at the lad with its huge clawed arm and got him from the leg up. I wished I'd brought the bayonet, but even so, a headshot from the Model 10 gave even that big fellow pause. We retreated down a black tunnel as quickly as was possible while the beasts were recovering. We had to keep moving. Eliot leaned on me, his breath whistling through clenched teeth. I tried to find someplace safer, a niche in the wall, a half-collapsed archway. Eventually, we hunkered down behind some broken stones while I applied a bandage to his main wound. It's lucky I always bring my little kit to this kind of situation. Hang in there, pal, I whispered. You stay awake, and once we're out of this hellhole, I'll buy you the biggest bottle of whiskey you can stomach. Probably need it after tonight. Eliot tried to smile, but he only looked like a corpse that remembered a joke. I'll say this, I never thought I'd miss the front line trenches. At least those were just mud and bullets. Down here, we had these stinking critters and the sound of something unseen scraping. Once or twice, I caught a smell like rotten fish, too. These tunnels weren't just old. 1700s old if the style of brickwork meant anything. Some parts felt older, like something that had been dug long before Boston ever sprouted above. Pillars leaned at uneasy angles, and carvings on the walls, twisting shapes and runes, suggested this place had been hollowed out by people who prayed to gods no sane man should acknowledge. This place was evil to the core. We moved on. My shotgun was a comfort in my hand. In the war, I'd popped more than a few kraut helmets with it. Here, I'd just as soon stick it under a ghoul's chin. But ammo was limited. I came prepared, but I hadn't expected something like this. I had maybe 3 shells left, tops. I'd fired a few at that big ugly brute who nicked Eliot, but damn thing didn't drop like anything natural would. At least I still had the crowbar. At one point, after following a gently downward sloping tunnel, we turned a corner and stumbled into a chamber that made my skin crawl. It was taller, and the ceiling was lost in darkness. The floor tilted towards a pit in the center, and from that pit a sickly glow seeped up. A pale greenish yellow like curdled moonlight. Eliot, half unconscious, moaned at the sight of it, and I felt my stomach twist. I didn't want to get near it, but curiosity made me take a few steps closer. In that hollow, I swear, I glimpsed something moving. A shape half submerged in what looked like viscous glowing water. Around the rim were carvings of monstrous faces, part man, part beast, mouths twisted into hateful grins. This had to be where Pickman got his sick ideas, the source of his nightmare drawings, some well or portal to hell knows where. If we fell in, or even lingered too long, I suspected we'd see things that would splinter our minds. And those carvings looked ancient, but like nothing I'd ever seen. Anyways, if that bastard Jack and those crazies were part of some cult, maybe this was what they worshipped. I didn't want to dwell on it. Eliot tugged at my arm, sobbing, just wanting to get out. We backed away slowly. I didn't speak, neither did Eliot. There was no joking about that place. Even a tough mug like me knows when to keep his trap shut. To imagine I've been walking on the streets above for decades, without guessing what was here. Outside in the tunnel, I couldn't help but give a small chuckle as my mind procured an image of a crowd of bureaucrats at the mayor's office, trying to wrap their minds about how to deal with something like this. Eventually, after several turns around dark corners, I heard chattering. Human voices, low and murmuring. The shadowy blokes from before had to be the same rats that dropped us down here. I peeked around a corner, saw a flickering lantern, 3 figures in cloaks, their faces hidden, standing guard by what looked like a narrow corridor leading upward. An exit. I prayed it was. Trouble was, they'd see us coming a mile away. Behind us a scrape on the stones. Eliot stiffened, and I turned just in time to see one of those damned ghouls creeping along the floor. It was hunched, like a naked leathery man, but not quite man. Its limbs too long, teeth yellow and irregular. Behind it lurked the bigger one, that alpha ghoul we'd tangled with before. I could see its ugly head was covered in blood. I had 2 choices: make noise and alert the cloaked morons, or stay quiet and get eaten by these freaks. Neither sounded great. "Sorry about this, lad," I whispered to Eliot. "Time for a ruckus." I raised my shotgun, aimed at a stack of rubble in front of the hooded fellows. A single trigger pull boomed like thunder in that cramped space. The shot blasted through the silence, ricocheting off stone, scattering debris. The men cried in pain and confusion, not knowing what hit them. Good, that gave us a chance. The ghouls, startled by the sound, hissed and jerked back. I grabbed Eliot and rushed forward, dragging him with me. He stumbled, nearly pulling me down, but we bolted as fast as we could toward the faint light at the end of that corridor. I heard snarls directly behind me. The alpha lunged, caught hold of the shotgun. I could have tried to save it, but I needed both hands to haul Eliot with enough speed anyway. So instead, adding my strength to the ghouls, I managed to give its ugly snout a good thwack with the handle. The thing was more annoyed than injured, but it bought us precious moments. My old Remington gone to the monsters, hell of a loss. I promised myself I'd come back one day and pump these freaks full of lead all over again. But that was a lie I told to keep myself moving. With all foes behind us, Eliot and I made a break, using our final reserves. The corridor angled upward. The air got fresher. Behind us I heard them shouting in some strange language that made my head hurt. Every few steps Eliot whimpered, as I more or less dragged him, his boots scraping stone. Then, sweet mercy, I saw a faint glow of light through wooden boards. I shouldered through, splintering the rotted wood. We stumbled out into an alley so old and narrow, it felt like a coffin. Two of the cloaked men appeared on our heels, seeming a little dazed still, but they soon wished they hadn't followed, after I gave them a few good swings with my trusty crowbar. My heart hammered, but we pushed on. We didn't stop moving until we were well away from the alley and on a larger street, bustling with morning crowds. We must have been a sight, dust-covered and bloody. The normalcy of the street and the crowd came as a shock after spending the night in that grim underworld. But we didn't fancy those madmen finding us again, so we shook it off and jumped into a cab to anywhere. I figured we should do something to shake them of our tail if they decided to follow us, so after a bit we quickly switched to another cab and finally went to a hospital in a different direction. I paid the first driver to keep on going and not come back to that area for a while. The doctors gave me looks like they thought I'd done this to Eliot myself and just wanted to avoid charges. But what could I tell them? That a crew of degenerates and subterranean dog cannibals had sliced him up good. That we'd been spelunking in tunnels older than the Republic, dodging nightmares out of some lunatic's painting. In the end, Eliot got stitches and morphine and went into a deep sleep. He'd live, though he might limp for a bit. I promised to check on him when I felt human again. I got a bed in a different ward to rest, but I had no intention of using it. I left that hospital grim and hollow, sneaking away before the cops got there. I had no plans to share our tale with the newspapers or the police. They'd never believe me. But I made another promise to myself. If I ever caught a glimpse of that Jack or any of his cronies, I'd repay them in spades. They might have robbed me of my shotgun, my pride, and nearly my friend's life. But I was still Mickey Rowan. I'd made it out of that maze of horrors alive. I thought it wise to leave Boston for a while, visit my folks while they were still around. And I let Thurber know some evil bastards might be poking about, and he'd better avoid his usual haunts. And if they ever come sniffing around again, there'll be no running. Next time, I'll tear those spooks up for sure. The Transformation. I have given my all and can give nothing more. I now long for those dreaming lands I have visited so many times, both in flickering visions and, on rare nights, in waking reality. Before I was only ever an awkward guest in those lands, an outsider who walked timidly behind those that truly belonged. That ends tonight. I will cast off my fragile humanity and take my rightful place among the pack. A hunter, free at last from all constraints. Members of the Order have already collected my best works. The studio stands hollow now, a husk of boards and brick that shall sleep in darkness for centuries more. I used to feel pity for the uninitiated, those who saw only the shape of terror in my art, never glimpsing the greater design. But tonight, it is not pity I feel. It is hunger. I descend into the tunnels below the well in the old cellar. The air below the well reeks of dank earth. As I climb down, I hear the familiar scraping of claws on ancient masonry. Their eyes glimmer in the gloom. My brethren, ghouls of the deeper tunnels, dwellers who slip between worlds with feral ease. They make room for me. Soon the newest, if not the youngest member of the pack. In the chamber of the gate, with its carvings that were old before man set foot in the Americas, we all assemble, The clan chief, huge and powerful with shining eyes, greets me with unusual solemnity and chants the words that wake the power of the portal set in the slanting floor before us. My brethren nods to me and howls and meeps as they run down into the gate's pulsing yellowish light to await me on the other side. The clan chief speaks in his growling voice the words I am to repeat. 3 times I chant that elder verse before he also nods and slips into the light. Now I wait for my acceptance or my doom. It is only moments that pass, but excruciatingly slow moments before bright tendrils of power reach for me and slowly pulls me into the gate's mighty embrace. My skin prickles. The swirling bright tunnel swallows me. It is not as before, not simply a passage, but a transformation. Pain erupts through every cell of my body. My spine arches, nails become talons, teeth lengthen and sharpen. Yet all the while, I exult in this monstrous birth. This final step might be agony, but more than that, it is rapture. In that timeless passage, I know at last the roads to the dreamlands, the subterranean paths that lead to Kadath and even deeper beyond mortal sight. Where once I skulked at the edges, an unworthy guest, I shall now exult running with the pack, devouring those who trespass on our domain. Gone is Richard Upton Pickman, the painter of horrors. In his place stands a ghoul, a creature of the depths, a faithful child of ancient gloom. I leave behind empty frames, cryptic sketches, and a city that cannot understand what has transpired beneath its streets. Let the unsuspecting worry over my disappearance. Let them guess where I have gone. I follow the clan's writhing procession, my eyes sharpened, all my senses awakened, my claws touching moist grass and slick stone. Yes, I have given my all, and in so doing, I have found what I always sought, my true form, my eternal abode, and the savage freedom of the dreamland's dark underbelly.